alaikum. Thank you everybody for joining us. We have assembled a group of eminent experts and practitioners in the field of Islamic art, Islamic academia, scholarship, museum, curatorial sciences. So I look forward to learning from them as much as I hope you are looking forward to as well. So our topic today is Islamic art going mainstream? And so there's been a lot of changes in the past decade or so. I'll give you some examples. There's been a plethora of Islamic-oriented museums and spaces that have opened all over the world. And we can think about the Islamic Arts Museum in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia. The Aga Khan Museum that opened just a few months ago in Toronto in Canada. The Museum of Islamic Art by I.M. Pei in Doha in Qatar. The Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilization. The Islamic Museum of Australia. Tariq Rajab Museum in Kuwait. Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyya in Kuwait. The Bayt al-Quran in Bahrain. So there, you see, there is a sort of a trend that has started a few decades ago but has almost gone even more mainstream than it was previously. Other than in the Islamic world, we've seen a number of museums in the West dedicate spaces to Islamic art. You see Victoria Albert Museum in London, the Louvre Museum in Paris, the British Museum as well, and the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Several major auction houses have dedicated Islamic art auctions twice a year. In fact, just last October, 12 months ago, at an auction in London, Sotheby's sold a brass astrolabe for £1 million. That was actually a record for most expensive astrolabe, again, affiliated to Islam, that was sold at auction. Just a few months ago, in April 2015, an auction by Bonhams sold about £6 million of Islamic and Indian artifacts. So think of the Louvre Museum, for example, that received $23 million from Prince Al-Walid bin Talal of Saudi. Think of the Jamil family, very, very huge art patrons from the region, who gave the Victoria and Albert Museum about $10 million. I'm not sure if these numbers are public, by the way, so don't tell anybody I told you. Huh? So, but we're only seeing a small part of what is available. The Louvre Museum has a collection of 14,000 objects, of which they're only showing 3,000. So they're only showing, what, 20% or so? So over the past few years, not only have museums opened, but exhibitions have taken place. But we're not only here to talk about Islamic art, which we understand as being miniature painting, metalwork, rugs and carpets, manuscripts, ceramics, jewelry and textile. But there's also been a huge Islamic design economy that you might have seen an exhibition in the main hall. There's been graffiti associated with Islamic art. I'm not sure if you can call graffiti Islamic, but at least there's some kind of affiliation, and we're happy to have one of the pioneers in that field present in the hall today. But enough of me. I want to hear from our own speakers. We have Ulrika Al-Khamis, who is a strategic advisor with the Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilization. Dr. Khamis has over 26 years of experience in museum work, academic teaching, and research. She's sitting in the middle. We also have, to my left, Ahmed Salim, who's the producer and director of 1001 Inventions, a UK-based educational organization for science and cultural heritage. If you haven't seen his films, then you're missing out. 50 million people have seen his films. 6 million visitors have visited exhibitions that he has put together. At the very end, we have Mustafa Faour, who is the founder and director of the Islamic Museum in Australia, which is in Melbourne, opened early last year, which showcases both historic and contemporary Islamic art. Last but not least, we have an institution in her own self, Salwa Maqdadi, who is an art historian, scholar, curator, and now associate professor at New York University. She has written extensively on Arab and Islamic arts and curated a number of exhibitions. So this is really an incredible panel. I can't wait to hear from them. Who would like to start? Let's go with Mustafa. Mustafa, is Islamic art going mainstream? You have 3 minutes each to give us a brief answer, introduction to that. 3 minutes, and I'll cut you off.
Thanks, Sultan. Appreciate you putting me at the front of the pack. Is Islamic art going mainstream? Well, to answer that question, we now have an Islamic art museum in Australia, Melbourne. Anyone knows that that's over a 13-hour flight away. But really, what came about and how these museums are growing, and Sultan touched on these topics, and the number of museums in the Western world, let alone someone as far place as Australia. And to my understanding and research, when we came up with the concept of the Islamic Museum of Australia, really it was a microcosm of the investment that the Gulf states that I believe are ahead of the curve in investing, not only for the Islamic art, but also to share the culture, the heritage and history. The panel today that you see here, I spoke with many of them along my journey and the team's journey in establishing the museum, who are really one of the foundations to this evolution and this development. So I believe the Islamic Museum of Australia is a practical and live example that Islamic art is going mainstream. For a country that represents less than 2% of Muslims, we've only been open just over a year and have generated approximately 15,000 visitors. I wish it was 50 million like Ahmed, but however, 70% of our visitors are actually people of non-Muslim background, which is quite interesting. Now, whether it's the unfortunate circumstances that are happening globally, people want to know more. And we believe art is a universal language, and the beauty of Islamic art has two folds behind it. The first is the beauty of the art. The second is the educational component that the Islamic Museum of Australia believes can enhance social cohesion and community harmony, especially in minority Muslim countries. So while I'm ahead and Sultan hasn't given me the look, I'm going to cut there and pass it on to the next person.
Thank you, Mustafa. Dr. Ulrika, is Islamic art going mainstream?
In order to answer that question, we have to start with definitions. What is Islamic art and what is mainstream? You could argue that in some places Islamic art has always been mainstream, but let us just define a little bit more what Islamic art actually is, because Islamic art is something very different to a Muslim from what it might mean to a Western academic person. The discipline of Islamic art in academic terms, of course, was developed in the late 19th, early 20th century, largely by Western scholars, experts, connoisseurs, and collectors indeed. And when they started defining the field as it was defined according to their particular interests and by a very culture-conditioned view of the region. And at the beginning, of course, the interest was not at all focused on the religion or the culture or indeed the people, but it was focused on the artifacts in their own right and to their own end. So when we talk of Islamic art today, I think the definition has become much, much broader, has been watered down, and has also started causing a lot of confusion and anxiety around the edges. To a Muslim, of course, Islamic art is very easily defined because it is simply al-fan al-Islami. That means the art that is connected with the service to Islam or with the ritual of Islam. So we all have no problem defining a mosque as Islamic art, a prayer carpet as Islamic art, a carved Quran stand or indeed a Quran manuscript as Islamic art. So other items might exude the spirit of Islam. But as such, if we go down that route and we observe that definition, it is very much more limited than Islamic art is understood nowadays in international contexts. So we then come to mainstream. What is mainstream? If you are interested in calligraphy, for example, then somebody like Hafiz Osman, a very famous Ottoman calligrapher, is most certainly mainstream. But is he mainstream to us? Probably not. If we have one of the famous artists, let's say pioneer artists nowadays, to an Iraqi, Jawad Salim is most certainly mainstream, but only to those who know a little bit about Iraqi art, modern and contemporary, will ever have heard the name. So what I'm saying is that we really have to be very precise when we place our definitions, because every approach to both Islamic art and to mainstream depends on very specific contexts.
Thank you, Doctor. Selwa, can you tell us, can you have your introduction to this?
Yes, Dr. Ulrika already clarified the definitions. And I'll go further to say that art historian Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom, who are both leading researchers in Islamic art and has published extensively on the subject, have declared this definition or what was considered Islamic art as a misnomer, and that this definition is way too wide and in scope, and that needs to be rethought. And so this is an ongoing debate now among art historians as is this how it should have been referred to in the end of the 19th century. At that time, at the end of the 19th century, about almost half a century had passed, and the artists from this region practice what we now refer to as modern art. They actually were Islamic artists or from other religions from countries dominated predominantly Muslim, and have traveled to Europe to learn more about European Western techniques of oil painting. As far back as in the 1753 was one of the first artists who left to Europe to learn more about this new art. And when they came back, and particularly in the mid-1880s, there has been a lot of work done by these artists in portraiture and landscape and all that, but this was not studied by the West. This was considered by the West as an imitation of Western art and not as authentic. They wanted to see a distinctive art that is distinct from the West. They did not look at knowledge creation as a shared by all, as we now look at global art, for example. So unfortunately, for almost 2 centuries, the art production in the region of Islamic countries was not studied by European scholars. And as Dr. Ulrika mentioned, the study kind of stopped at the end of the 1890s with the Qajar dynasty, which, by the way, is well known that they have practiced oil painting with oil for long periods. So basically what we need to look at when we talk about how is it that the West all of a sudden became interested in art now, and this is what is mainstream, is that the art from this region is being exhibited in mainstream art museums such as the Metropolitan, and as well traveling and curated from this region to the rest of the world, as like Bergil Foundation does, curating exhibitions from here that travel Singapore or England. I think this is where we need to say what happened in those almost 100 and over 170 years of production that was not studied, was not documented, because it was marginalized by the West.
Super interesting. Do we have to be documented by others to acknowledge that we have an art industry? Ahmed, your 3 minutes start now.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Good turnout as well, and everyone's still awake after lunch. Maybe those at the back, I'm not sure. So, 1001 Inventions tries to build relevance and appreciation for Islamic and Muslim civilization. And I think these are 2 key ingredients that you need in order to have a thriving Islamic art industry. Because if you don't know where this artist has come from, if you don't appreciate his culture, his heritage, then how can you value his work? You know, how do you build value for art if you don't find relevance for it in today's world? So the key questions which we're asking is, how do we build appreciation? Now, if you want to be appreciated as a person, when you go for a job interview, what do? You give your CV. What does your CV say? It says, this is what I did, this is where I came from, this is where I was before. You try to present your credentials that then someone looks at and says, I appreciate and I value what this person has to offer. So in the 21st century, when we find the situation that we're in today, there are huge threats against everything that's labeled Islamic or anything that comes from a Muslim's content. So what we're trying to do with 1,000 Inventions is say, guys, look, let's extend that CV. Let people understand that behind this artist is a legacy of tradition, a legacy of innovation, a legacy of creativity. And it's relevant today because it has its role and its impact in our lives today. So with our exhibitions and the films that we're doing around the world, we're trying to create that market. We're trying to prepare people to feel that this Islamic art has a value and has a relevance to our lives today. So we do that by combining great content, great narrative, with great production, with great partners, and timing. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the session, about what are the combinations, or what's the formula to take something mainstream. Now, if I was to say to you, someone like Ibn al-Haytham, who I don't know how many of you here know who he is, but you might recognize the name as this is a scientist from Muslim civilization over 1,000 years ago. Now, if I was to show you, unfortunately we don't have a PowerPoint today, but if I was to show you that 2 months ago in China, China's biggest science festival, with 1 million people coming to that festival called the China Science Festival, the mascot of this year's festival was Ibn al-Haytham. Now, imagine the mindset. This has to be a mindset of a group of people who appreciated what was coming from the Middle East. They valued it, and they felt it was relevant enough to put an Ibn al-Haytham mascot in the form of a caricature as the mascot of China's biggest science festival today. Thank you.
So I'm going to take a quick poll here. How many of you think there is such a thing as Islamic art? Put your hand up if you think there is such a thing as Islamic art. Okay. How many of you think that there's no such thing as Islamic art? These are artists from different countries, and people try to categorize all of them under the umbrella of Islamic art. Very interesting. Okay, so we are here in an Islamic economy summit. So I like to talk about Islamic design, but this is a business summit. So Mustafa, we have to ask you, how do you fundraise? How did you get your money? Were you able to convince people to pay for an Islamic museum? Why bother pay for an Islamic museum? And how did you do it?
Thanks for that tough question. I've probably experienced that for 5 years of my life, fundraising, especially as a not-for-profit organisation. I see a not-for-profit more difficult, in terms of fundraising than a business in general, where there's investment, you carry your investment. This is a more one-off contribution. There is no doubt, especially in Australia, that fundraising for an Islamic museum where 2% of your population is Muslims is a difficult task. And the museum is not a museum that's run or owned by governments or very high net worth or wealthy individuals. So we went and had to begin right from the start, and that was education. Educating governments, educating corporates, and educating communities on what we were trying to do and establish. The museum's objective is to provide social cohesion and community harmony through the use of art, especially the Islamic art, and education. Because we see art, especially Islamic art, as a universal language. So the fundraising process then went to educating people, and we obviously started with government. We were thankful enough that the Australian government, the Turkish government, the OIC, the Organisation of Islamic Conferences, endorsed and supported financially. Although it was only 20% of the funds needed, this endorsement then made it much more easier to then target the corporates. 80% of our funding came from corporates. Being a banker all my life, I think it made it a bit easier to know how do we then put this together to make corporates attracted to either give or sponsor the museum. I'd like to draw maybe one example is, which many of you might know, which is Etihad Airlines, who's a founding supporter and sponsor of the Islamic Museum of Australia. We took the angle that not only is this your corporate social responsibility to support the education in the environment we're at, but also a return on your investment through branding. The museum will attract 15,000 people. It will provide you access to showcase your brand. So we named a workshop after them. It's called the Etihad Workshop. So they got clear, tangible return, as well as this feeling of giving for a greater cause. And then that went around. So 90% of the funding was supported by Australian companies. 80% of the total funding was by corporations, and 70% by corporation, 20% by governments, and 10% by the local community.
So I want to take questions from the audience, but I want to ask you first in a poll, how many of you have been to the Islamic Museum in Doha? That's it? You guys need to go to museums, by the way. So, but it was designed by an American architect of Chinese origin. So just shows you that you don't have to be Muslim to create Islamic art. Ulrika, I just want to ask you quickly. I'm taking an audience question, by the way, after Ulrika. So prepare your questions. You work in a non-profit in a museum, but you have to work side by side with the commercial sector, auctioneers, collectors. What role do they play?
Well, I mean, for us in the non-profit sector, of course, we have a very interesting and important role to play in terms of providing expertise and knowledge and education, and particularly in an objective and non-self-interested way. As far as our museums are concerned, for example, the collections themselves, the galleries, are there for people to come and study the objects in order to learn and to gain more knowledge about the field of interest or the field of collecting. Because if you want to be a successful collector, then that is only possible if you actually have a broad intellectual knowledge about the field that you want to collect in, because only that way can you, at the simplest level, distinguish the dud from the worthy object and the original item from a fake, of which there are increasingly many around as the Islamic art market is taking off.
Who verifies the authenticity of Islamic art objects? Who checks?
Well, I mean, in our museum context, that's our bread and butter. So, and because, of course, we have many years of experience in terms of researching objects and visiting other museums' collections and knowing physically thousands of objects, we kind of develop an eye for whether something is authentic and right or not.
If somebody here wants to buy an Islamic artifact, where do they take it to check that this is an original or a fake?
Well, I mean, auction houses do provide that service.
To regular collectors? You don't have to be a huge collector?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you are interested, I mean, first of all, in the commercial sector, of course, it is upon the auction houses to check the authenticity of their artifacts. And they do have safety clauses where some houses have, for example, a 5-year return policy should the items turn out not right. Okay. You know, for different reasons, not only in terms of fake or authentic, but whether it was obtained legally or illegally, and so on.
Okay, we're going to take a question from the audience. So I want a question from over here, the lady over there. You have 10 seconds to ask your question. 8.
Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam.
How are you?
Go ahead. No,
I wanted to ask a question about the disconnect between Islamic history, and the school books, because...
Got the question. So what is the disconnect between what's the disconnect between Islamic history and the school books? Do the school books reflect the real Islamic history? They're written by Westerners. Are they genuine or not? No, we're done. We're done. Okay, go on.
Science.
Who wants to take that? I want Selwa to answer as well, but go ahead.
We're in the process of developing the national educational portal, which is aligned to the national school curriculum in Australia. Now, the disconnect obviously in Australia is that it has no Islamic history. So what we've done is obviously with our partners is develop this portal. So then let's say in grade 4, you have to cover a world explorer. In the Western world, most of the world explorers people cover is Marco Polo, except now they'll have content on Ibn Battuta, for example. So what we're doing is developing this national portal and content which aligns to the national school curriculum in Australia. That's one way we're tackling it.
You want to take this? Salwa, if you don't mind.
Well, very quickly, I would add, concur that it is very important to have the material ready and packaged. So, and libraries equipped with all the information, because the teachers don't have time to go do primary research to get information to their students. Mm-hmm. And what we have lacked in the Arab world, I've noticed, because I worked on this in the United States with museums, I had to create my own information for every single exhibition, which took years of time from me. So that's what we want institutions here to do. But at the saying that, we have so many great institutions here in Sharjah, in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi. Art and culture institutions are there, but we need as citizens to encourage them or demand for the children more programs that are accessible for different ages.
Ulrike?
I would say if the question is specific about Islamic history, there is an absolute disconnect between Islamic art, modern contemporary art, and Islamic history, because the traditional way to teach is simply the historic facts, the historic personalities, and up to the end of the Abbasid period, and that's it. Mm-hmm. But there is no element of wider culture, of art, of creativity that's generally discussed within the context. So what we are talking about here today is totally disconnected from what the ordinary kid in school actually learns. Mm-hmm. So there's a great importance to actually, and that I know there are religious sensitivities in introducing this, but that the curriculum is made to include aspects of culture, of the tangible arts, and of course also the intangible arts, which are very important, although perhaps not commercially brandable or whatever. But that is absolutely lacking in many, let's say, mainstream contexts.
Okay.
There.
So before Ahmed answers, I want to take a quick poll. Who here has collected any Islamic art? Who here has in their home a single work by an Islamic artist? About 1% in an Islamic conference. Who here works in a company that collects art in general? Very, very bad signs. Okay, so I'd like Ahmed to answer that lady's very popular question. But also, Ahmed, I want you to talk about the New Silk Road.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
So, I think you were talking about science, right? So, how many of you were taught the following narrative at school? Fall of the Greek and Roman Empire, Dark Ages for 1,000 years, 1,500 years, rise of the European Renaissance. How many were taught that? Okay, that's what I was taught. My school book was Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, and then it went from there. The next page was Isaac Newton, Galileo. There was a total gap. There was no Chinese, there was no Indian, there was no African, there was no Turkic people, there was no Arab civilization and Muslim civilization. So when you create a generation of people who read that, whether it's in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world, what kind of appreciation will that person have towards Muslim civilization? Like, I grew up in the UK, I was taught that, and I felt I had an identity crisis, which I'm sure many of you face a similar issue. You're not really British, you're not really Arab, you're kind of somewhere in the middle. So at this point, you become vulnerable. You get to 14, 15, 16 years old, you want to stamp your mark on the world, My English mates were putting punk hairstyles and stuff so that they could say that I exist. And then I do recall that some of my Muslim friends started going down the line of extremism. They were vulnerable because they didn't know who they were. Mm-hmm. They were in this gap. And that builds an inferiority complex, and it creates a very dangerous formula in the 21st century. Now look at the other side. My English friends at school. They would look at you in the classroom and say, well, who are you? You know, what relevance do you have today? How can we appreciate your existence? And I remember about 10 years ago, one of the top talk shows on TV famously said, what has the Middle East ever given us? We should nuke the entire place, right? That was the mindset. So these, you know, when you're talking about Islamic culture, talking about Islamic art, when you're talking about the 21st century that we live in today, we need to understand the psychology and the mindset of the people that we interact with, within the Middle East and outside as well. We have to fix that because that is the future. That's the way in this 21st century we are connected. We are a highly connected society. You must know about the other person, whether you have an inferiority problem or you have a superiority complex. Education is key. Now, you mentioned the Silk Road. Over the last 2 years, with the depreciating oil prices, I don't know how that's affected people in this room. Put your hands up if you've been affected by oil price issues. Okay, so I would say 90% of 1,000 Inventions projects in the Middle East have been affected. Our projects in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Abu Dhabi, everywhere, it's been affected. And if you told me 2 years ago, what is the connection between oil price and doing an exhibition on Islamic science? 2 years ago, I would say to you, that has absolutely nothing to do with us. What has Islamic art and a gallery here in Dubai got to do with oil price? The reality is we are totally connected because we are considered non-essential. Things like education, things like art and culture, these are considered at the top level as non-essential issues. Therefore, when budgets had to be reduced because of the oil price issues and war in the region and these things, the net result was projects stopped. So we started looking elsewhere. It was like, okay, there's a temporary kind of freeze here in the Middle East where we're not getting much deals happening with sponsors and governments. We looked elsewhere. And what we found was that in Central Asia and China, there is a huge new initiative which they're calling the Silk Road Initiatives. I don't know how many in this room know what that is. But if you look online, as soon as you leave this auditorium, you will see that in the last 24 months, more than $1 trillion of business and trade has been happening between the Central Asian countries and China. Financing roads, building ports, there's a huge growth of cultural exhibitions, cultural galleries that are popping up, all connected to the cultures that exist on the Silk Road. And the narrative is, China and these countries are saying, why are we all infatuated about dealing and trading with Europe and America? We have a tradition, we have a legacy of over 1,000 years of working together. It's called the Maritime Silk Road and the Silk Road. So let's revive that. The 21st century, let's revive that. Let's create a new economic hub. Let's bring our identity to the world. When we traveled over there to meet with ministers of culture across the region and ministers of education, this is exactly what they said. They said, look, if you could do for us what you guys are doing for Muslim civilization, then we're ready to sign deals with you right now. There was an alignment. They said, look, we share the common problem. We have that gap in the history books just like you guys, and we want the world to know and appreciate who we are. Okay. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask Salwa in a minute about the difference between modern and contemporary art, and why institutions like the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, the Arab World Institute, is called the Arab and not the Islamic World Institute. So I'll ask you that in a minute, but in the room we have a couple of people I wanted to give a chance to speak very, very briefly. You have 1 minute over here. I need the mic in the front. So you have 1 minute each. I need the mic over here. No, these are invited speakers. So in the second row, I have the gentleman in the suit. That's Giuseppe, who curated the Islamic design exhibition that's in the main hall. If you haven't seen it, take a look after our... you have 1 minute, Giuseppe.
Thank you, Sultan. Everything started...
Stand up.
Okay. Everything started in 2014 when the Sharjah was nominated Cultural Islamic Capital. So we were requested to have an event, an exhibition to celebrate this important event. So we decided to have an open call for submission for designers to submit ideas, proposal with idea of Islam. So basically, all designers from local international designers were invited to submit ideas with the idea of Islam. And basically, we were not inviting only Muslim designers, but also like from this different background. So what we got, it was a very interesting selection of artworks and design, and all of these projects are on an exhibition that was presented in Sharjah for the first time, and later on was presented also in Istanbul during the Istanbul Design Week, and in Milan during the Design Week as well. So the idea was to this exhibition to travel all over the world and to spread like the message of Islam under a modern interpretation of the idea of Islam, basically.
Thank you, Giuseppe. And in front of Giuseppe, we have a pioneering artist called El Cid, who's French-Tunisian. And Giuseppe, El Cid, can you tell us a little bit about your work as a calligraphy artist, bringing together calligraphy and graffiti under the Islamic theme? I'm not sure if that's right and fair to categorize you there, but you have a minute.
So actually, my art was born, I think, out of an identity crisis. So I was born and raised in Paris. So when I was like 17, 18, I didn't feel really French. So I went back to my roots in Tunisia, and I didn't really speak Arabic at this time as well. And I thought that the first step, like to get back to my roots was to learn the Arabic language. So I started to learn how to read and write Arabic, and I discovered Arabic calligraphy later on. And I used to do graffiti back in the days before, and I just felt the need to get into Arabic calligraphy. And this is how I brought this art into my graffiti. And I developed a kind of style that I'm trying to actually put all over the world now. And I'm trying to represent, actually, like to be an ambassador, of my own culture, and to break all the stereotype, that we have, against, Muslim and Arab in general. But my art is not, I don't know if I should consider my art Islamic art, but I'm inspired by the Arabic calligraphy, which is linked to Islam in a way. But it's more, I'm just trying to, as Mustafa mentioned earlier, try to get the beauty of his art and showing that, the beauty doesn't need a translation. It's like universal. Anybody can relate to it.
Thank you. Selwa, modern and contemporary is very confusing. What's modern, what's contemporary, what's antique Islamic artifacts? There's too many words that we don't understand. Please decipher them for us.
In 2 minutes?
You have 2 minutes.
Very quickly, I just want to go back to education. I just want to say, if we don't write our history, others will.
Well done.
And that's really what happened in art. We have very few young people majoring in the history of Islamic art. So mostly they are non-Western, actually. Even if you go to Indonesia and Malaysia, it's a similar situation. So I encourage many to also look at the classical Islamic art and also look at what's happening now in contemporary and modern. Could easily connect both. There is so much going on here. And this all actually started in around 1967, after the war, when many modern Arab artists were enchanted with Arab nationalism, started looking at their roots or asala. And they started experimenting with calligraphy, modernizing it, abstracting it, looking at it. This was what we refer to as hurufiyya, which is part of what is modern, at least in this region, the Arab world. Then we didn't hear about any relationship with Islamic art for some time until September 11, when there's all of a sudden a major interest in art of the Islamic world from people who don't have the right education about this region of the world. In the West, they knew very little about neither contributions to science nor other. So to them, it was Islamic art where you were not able to do figurative art, so it was very limited. But what came on the scene is art that was concerned with contemporary issues. And many of these artists, like El Cid, went back to their roots and looked at calligraphy. Others looked at miniature. For example, Shazia Iskandar, a Pakistani artist, who actually learned the proper formal techniques of miniature in Pakistan at a university, and then she started to experiment. So the differences here between what we know in the past is that we had a more formal guidelines for producing art of the 18th, 17th century that we refer to as Islamic, While now in the contemporary, the artists are free to experiment, use different techniques, like Shazia Skandar now is using video art, incorporating miniature in video art in very creative ways. So this is what we need to look at, and the Jameel Prize is actually rewarding those who whose art practice actually is inspired by art. The question is why the Institut du Monde Arabe is referred to as Arab and not Islamic is because they also they look at the Arab world's history from ancient times to the present. So there is art, pre-Islamic art is part of their collection, as well as art. And remember, it was founded in the 1980s when this notion that the modern can also be Islamic and this kind of definitions were not there. And one other issue to think about is that, like example, Institut du Monde Arabe had an exhibit about the body, a contemporary exhibit, which may conflict actually with religious thoughts. So, and then here we have an issue with the references to contemporary art as Islamic art, in the sense that you have Iraqi artists, for example, working in Norway, and how does his work relate to Fatimite art from centuries past? So what is common between a contemporary artist and an artist who produced work during the Mamluk period? What is the commonality? So we need to be really careful and know that there are many ways we can describe art of the contemporary period. It's a global art that is influenced by many cultures maybe, and all kinds of techniques are used, and therefore we need not, and the artists would tell you, we do not like to be categorized or ghettoized into narrow classifications. We want to be free. At the same time, we respect where we come from. We take time to go back to Tunisia and learn our culture. We are not negating our culture, but rather we want to have this freedom.
So sadly, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to give each one of the other three speakers who haven't spoken much a minute, maybe as a closing statement. Mustafa, Ulrika, and Ahmed. Maybe Mustafa, if you can just tell us maybe final thoughts in 1 minute.
Okay. I think we touched on a couple of points, and Ahmed and Salwa did as well. The importance of content and certification. And I said this at the start, some of the founders or people that we use and rely on at the Islamic Museum of Australia, because without this, there is no doubt there'll be a lack of authentication, lack of value, because without understanding the era and the knowledge and the surrounding, you can't value and appreciate the work. So I just wanted to touch on the importance of that and the role 1001 and the other institutions play in our global environment, because there is a shortage. So we rely on these Gulf states and these organisations to produce it. In terms of traditional and contemporary, we at the Islamic Museum of Australia have both traditional and contemporary. The reason being is because Islamic art is relatively new in Australia, so they need to go on an educational learning curve. So we go through the history of where calligraphy originally and how it originally began, all the way to calligraphy and modern calligraphy that we showcase as well. The Islamic Museum of Australia, we wanted to be a platform to support Australian Muslim artists. And by housing contemporary works, like, for example, people of non-Muslim background, like Dr. Philip George, who has Islamic art on surfboards. People know the Australian culture of surfboards. So we want to use this not only as an expression of education, but also a way to enhance social cohesion and community harmony.
Thank you. Dr. Ulrika.
Yes, I just want to sum up the importance of definitions again, because the contemporary and the modern, as we have seen, does and does not emerge from this pool of historic Islamic art, because really we have two strands that are active today. One is a strand, as Salwa was saying, of artists that continue the old art traditions, either in a modernized or contemporary way, or indeed in the very traditional way. And you can spend a lot of good money on an exquisite piece of traditional craft wherever that might be from, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, Morocco, wherever. At the same time, you have the modern and contemporary developments which started in the late 19th, early 20th century, mainly under Western influence, first with painting and to a lesser extent sculpture, and then of course gradually also evolving into or incorporating the new media. And all of these have their very own history and their very own specific evolution. And for anybody who wants to be a successful collector or indeed investor, you have to understand the scene and the history evolution in detail, because only that will allow you to make an informed decision, because ultimately it is the intrinsic value of your artifact that will also ensure its lasting material value. There is a lot of how shall I say, artwork around nowadays that is pretending to be something that it very blatantly is not, and it is only your knowledge and your deep interest and love of the field that you are dealing with that will prevent you from buying something, perhaps even for investment purposes, that will not give you $5 in a 10 years time. So education and knowledge and an appreciation of the intrinsic value of the artifact before the material value and the price label is the absolute key if you want to be successful.
Ahmed, your closing statement?
Okay, if you have money, buy Islamic art. Okay. Why? Because we're going to see in our lifetime a huge growth in the demand for content, whether it's art, film, music, from an Islamic value system. And to me, the main issue here is that the content, the narratives that we have, the stories that we want to tell the world, have a depth. They have an intellectual depth, they have ideology, they have values, they present alternative to the world. And we're living in a world where everything became valueless. You buy something, you throw it away the next day. You read a tweet, you throw it away. You get a book, throw it away. Read just quick. We're losing that connection to tradition and this legacy in Muslim civilization. I believe that in our lifetime, we're going to see a huge growth in that area. We see it because we are active in the market. We have projects in Brazil, we have projects in India, we have projects in the US, projects in Europe, projects in the Far East. So we see that, we feel it. So that's my closing remark. Thank you.
So there's a plea from the panelists. Please encourage your family members to study about Islamic art. Encourage your institutions to collect Islamic art. Visit museums, visit exhibitions. Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Salwa. Thank you, Ulrika. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you all for attending.